We've all met someone who judged us before they knew us, who saw our surface and decided our worth. Sometimes the deepest wisdom comes wrapped in the most unexpected packages. In the frontier town of Belmare, Evangeline Harrow steps off the stage with her fancy education and firm beliefs about who deserves respect. When she meets Colt McRae, a towering cowboy with calloused hands, she sees exactly what she expects a simple laborer. So she decides to put him in his place with a challenge designed to embarrass him in front of the whole town. "If you're so smart, speak Latin," she dares him. What happens next changes everything she thought she knew about the men of the West. The Latin phrase that comes from his lips is so beautiful and perfect, it leaves the entire crowd speechless. What was the phrase that shocked everyone and made this educated woman question everything she believed? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dust from the eastbound stage hadn't yet settled when Evangeline Harrow stepped onto the weathered planks of Belmare's main street, her polished boots clicking against wood that had been worn smooth by countless frontier boots before hers. She clutched her leather portfolio against her chest, a rich mahogany case that held her father's business documents and her own carefully written notes about civilizing this remote corner of the American West through commerce and proper education. The August sun beat down mercilessly on the small town that seemed to shimmer in the heat like something from a fever dream. Evangeline had expected rough conditions, but the reality of Belmare struck her with an almost physical force. The main street stretched barely 3 blocks, lined with buildings that looked as though they'd been thrown together by men, more concerned with shelter than beauty. The Silver Dollar Saloon dominated one end of the street, its bat-winged doors propped open to reveal shadows and the sound of rough laughter. At the other end stood Milliken's General Store, its front porch sagging under the weight of supplies and the feet of men who seemed to have nothing better to do than whittle and spit tobacco juice into the dust. Between these landmarks sat a handful of other establishments, the barber shop with its red-striped pole, the blacksmith's forge that sent sparks dancing in the afternoon air, and a small building with a hand-painted sign reading Doc Patterson Medicine, Dentistry. Everything looked temporary, as if the whole town might pack up and move on at any moment, leaving nothing behind but worn patches of earth and the ghosts of ambition. Evangeline had spent the last 4 years at Miss Whitmore's finishing school for young ladies in St. Louis, where she'd learned French conversation, piano forte, and the subtle art of managing household staff. She could discuss the latest novels from Europe, arrange flowers according to the principles of aesthetic harmony, and write letters so elegant that they could charm money from the most reluctant creditor. Her father, Theodore Harrow, had invested considerable funds in her education because he believed that a cultured daughter would be an asset in his expanding business empire. Now, standing in the dust and heat of Belmare, those accomplishments felt as useful as a silk dress in a thunderstorm. "Miss Harrow?" A voice called from her left, and she turned to see a thin man in a rumpled suit approaching. His face was weathered but kind, and he removed his hat as he drew near. "I'm Samuel Milliken. Your father wrote that you'd be arriving today." "Mr. Milliken," Evangeline extended her gloved hand with practiced grace. "I trust you received my father's instructions regarding the property assessments." "Yes, ma'am. Though I have to say, some folks around here aren't too pleased about the land purchases. Your father's been buying up quite a bit of territory through his representatives." Evangeline's chin lifted slightly. She'd heard this concern before, in letters from her father's various business associates. There was always resistance when progress came to backward places. "Change is never easy for people set in their ways, Mr. Milliken, but my father's investments will bring prosperity to this region. Better roads, improved commerce, perhaps even a proper school." Milliken's expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced, but he was too polite to argue with a lady fresh from the East. Well, I've got the documents you'll be needing, and I've arranged for you to stay at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house. It's the finest accommodation in town. As they walked toward the boarding house, a two-story building that looked marginally more solid than its neighbors, Evangeline became aware of the stares following her progress down the street. Men paused in their conversations to watch her pass, and women emerged from doorways to whisper among themselves. She'd expected curiosity, but there was something else in their gazes, wariness perhaps, or suspicion. "The folks here are good people," Milliken said, apparently noticing her discomfort. "They're just not used to ladies of your refinement." Evangeline nodded, though privately she wondered if refinement was truly what they saw when they looked at her. More likely they saw money, and the changes that money would bring to their simple lives. She'd read enough about frontier communities to know that they valued self-reliance above all else, and many would see her father's business ventures as a threat to their independence. The boarding house proved to be a pleasant surprise. Mrs. Henderson, a plump woman with graying hair and flour-dusted hands, greeted Evangeline with genuine warmth and showed her to a clean, simply furnished room on the second floor. The window looked out over the main street, providing a view of the entire town and the vast expanse of prairie that stretched beyond it. "Supper's at 6, Mrs." Henderson said, smoothing the quilt on the narrow bed. "Nothing fancy, but it's filling. Most of the men who work the ranches come in for meals, so it can get a bit lively." After Mrs. Henderson left, Evangeline unpacked her belongings and arranged them carefully in the small dresser. Her books, Emerson's essays, a volume of Tennyson's poetry, and her treasured copy of Pride and Prejudice took up residence on the bedside table. Her clothes, though practical by St. Louis standards, suddenly seemed absurdly elaborate for life in Belmare. She opened her portfolio and reviewed her father's instructions once more. Theodore Harrow had big plans for this region. The railroad would reach this area within 2 years, and he intended to own the most valuable land when it did. Cattle ranching was already profitable here, but with rail access, the profits would multiply tenfold. Her job was to oversee the final land acquisitions and ensure that the property was being managed efficiently. It was important work, the kind of responsibility her father had never given her before. She was determined to prove that his faith in her education and judgment was well placed. At 6 o'clock, she made her way downstairs to the dining room, where Mrs. Henderson had set a long table with mismatched chairs and simple white plates. The other boarders were already gathering a mix of ranch hands, traveling salesmen, and local businessmen who preferred Mrs. Henderson's cooking to their own bachelor efforts. The conversation was loud and informal, full of talk about cattle prices, weather patterns, and local gossip. Evangeline took a seat near one end of the table and tried to follow the various threads of discussion, but the men spoke in a casual shorthand that assumed knowledge she didn't possess. They mentioned brands and breeding stock, water rights and grazing permits, all as naturally as her finishing school friends had discussed fashion and music. "You must be the lady from back east," said a bearded man seated across from her. "I'm Jim Crawford. I run cattle on the North Range." "Miss Evangeline Harrow," she replied. "I'm here on behalf of my father's business interests." The conversation around the table quieted slightly, and she sensed that same wariness she'd felt on the street. These men knew exactly what her father's business interests meant for their way of life. "Your father's been buying up a lot of land lately," Crawford said carefully. "Some folks are wondering what he plans to do with it all." "Improve it," Evangeline said with confidence. "Bring modern ranching methods, better breeding programs, more efficient operations. Everyone will benefit from increased prosperity in the region." A few of the men exchanged glances, and she realized her answer had probably sounded exactly like what it was, a recitation of her father's talking points, delivered by someone who'd never worked a day on a ranch. "Modern methods are fine," said another man, younger than Crawford but with the same sun-weathered look. "But some of us have been running cattle here for 10 years or more. We know the land, know the animals. Experience counts for something." "Of course it does," Evangeline agreed quickly. "I didn't mean to imply otherwise. My father values local knowledge. That's why he's hired local men to manage his properties." The conversation moved on to other topics, but Evangeline found herself thinking about the exchange. These men clearly felt defensive about their methods, their expertise. They saw her as an outsider who'd come to change everything they'd worked to build. The realization made her uncomfortable, though she couldn't quite say why. After dinner, she stepped out onto the boarding house's front porch to escape the stuffy dining room. The evening air was still warm, but a slight breeze carried the scent of prairie grass and distant campfires. The main street had grown quiet, though light and noise still spilled from the saloon. That's when she first saw him. He was leading a horse down the street, moving with the easy confidence of a man completely at home in his surroundings. Even in the fading light, she could see that he was tall, extraordinarily tall, with broad shoulders and the kind of lean strength that came from physical work rather than gymnasium exercises. His shirt was open at the collar, and his hat was pushed back on his head, revealing dark hair that needed cutting. He paused directly in front of the boarding house to adjust something on his horse's bridle, and in that moment, Evangeline got her first clear look at Colt McRae. His hands moved over the leather with practiced skill, and she found herself noticing the careful way he spoke to the animal, his voice too low for her to make out words but gentle in tone. This was clearly one of the local ranch hands, the kind of man her father employed to do the work that required more muscle than mind. Useful, certainly, but hardly the sort of person with whom a woman of her education and background would have any meaningful interaction. When he glanced up at the porch and touched the brim of his hat in a polite nod, she inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement, then turned and went back inside. Tomorrow would bring her first real day of business in Belmare, and she wanted to be prepared. She had no idea that her assumptions about the quiet cowboy would prove to be so catastrophically wrong. The morning sun had already climbed high enough to make the dusty street shimmer when Evangeline emerged from the boarding house, her leather portfolio secured under one arm and her parasol providing blessed shade from the relentless heat. She'd spent the early hours reviewing property maps and correspondence, preparing for her first official day of business in Belmare. Her destination was the new cattle operation her father had purchased, just outside town, a sprawling ranch that would serve as the cornerstone of his expansion into the territory. According to the paperwork, a foreman had already been hired to oversee the day-to-day operations, and she needed to inspect the property and meet with this man to discuss management strategies. As she walked down the main street, she noticed the same curious stares from yesterday, but today they seemed less wary and more openly skeptical. Word had clearly spread about her purpose in town, and she could feel the weight of their judgment with each step. Near the blacksmith's shop, a small crowd had gathered around a wagon loaded with supplies. The men were engaged in animated conversation about something, their voices carrying easily in the still air. As Evangeline approached, she caught fragments of their discussion, something about water rights and grazing boundaries, technical matters that her father's associates had assured her were easily resolved with proper legal documentation. "Morning, Miss Harrow." Samuel Milliken stepped away from the group, removing his hat with the same polite deference he'd shown yesterday. "Heading out to look at the Morrison place?" "Indeed. I understand the foreman will be meeting me there to discuss the operation." She glanced toward the group of men who had fallen silent at her approach. "I hope there aren't any complications with the property transfer." "Oh, no complications exactly," Milliken said, though something in his tone suggested otherwise. "It's just that Tom Morrison ran that spread for 15 years before your father bought him out. Some folks are wondering what changes might be coming." Before Evangeline could respond, one of the men from the group spoke up, a weathered rancher she recognized from the previous evening's dinner. "Changes are already here, seems like. Morrison's foreman got himself replaced by some drifter nobody knows much about. I'm sure my father hired someone with appropriate qualifications, Evangeline replied, her voice carrying the crisp authority she'd learned at finishing school. Experience and references are essential for managing such an important operation. Experience, sure, the rancher said, but there's different kinds of experience. Book learning ain't always the same as knowing the land. The comment stung more than it should have, perhaps because it echoed her own private doubts about her qualifications for this assignment. But Evangeline had been trained never to show uncertainty in public, especially not in front of men who might mistake hesitation for weakness. Education and practical knowledge complement each other, she said firmly. A man who can read and write, who understands modern ranching methods and business principles, will naturally be more effective than someone who relies solely on... She paused, searching for a diplomatic way to phrase her thoughts. Solely on what? The voice came from behind her, deep and quiet, but carrying clearly in the still air. Evangeline turned and found herself looking up considerably, up at the tall cowboy she'd glimpsed the previous evening. In daylight, she could see him more clearly, dark hair that curled slightly where it touched his collar, sharp blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once, and features that might have been handsome if they weren't so clearly marked by outdoor work and an obvious lack of refinement. His shirt was rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and darkened by sun and work. Everything about him proclaimed his station in life as clearly as her own clothing proclaimed hers. This was manual labor in human form. Useful for moving cattle and mending fences, but hardly the sort of man who could engage in meaningful conversation about business or literature or any of the subjects that occupied educated minds. "Solely on what, miss?" he repeated, his tone perfectly polite, but with something underneath that might have been amusement. Evangeline felt the attention of every man in the group focus on her response. This was clearly some kind of test, though she wasn't entirely sure of the rules. "I was simply observing that modern ranching requires more than traditional methods," she said carefully. "Education, formal education, provides advantages that can't be gained through experience alone." The tall cowboy nodded slowly, as if considering her words with great seriousness. "Education's a fine thing," he agreed. "What kind of education were you thinking of? The sort that teaches a man to read Latin and Greek, or the sort that teaches him which end of a cow gives milk?" A few of the men chuckled, and Evangeline felt heat rise in her cheeks. She was being mocked, gently but unmistakably, by a man whose own education probably hadn't extended beyond basic arithmetic and perhaps reading simple words. "Both types of knowledge have their place," she said, her voice taking on the cool tone she'd used at finishing school to put presumptuous servants in their proper place. "Though I hardly think classical languages are relevant to cattle ranching." "You might be surprised," the cowboy said mildly. "Lot of useful wisdom in those old books. Take Marcus Aurelius, for instance, Roman emperor. But he understood animals and men better than most folks." Evangeline blinked. She'd expected him to be confused by the reference, perhaps even intimidated by her superior education. Instead, he'd not only recognized the name, but demonstrated knowledge that seemed impossible given his obvious station in life. "You've read Marcus Aurelius?" she asked, unable to keep the skepticism from her voice. "Some." His tone remained perfectly even, but she caught something in his eyes, a flicker of what might have been disappointment. "Though I suppose you'd say that don't count for much, coming from somebody who works with his hands." The crowd had grown larger now, drawn by the unusual spectacle of the Eastern lady having a philosophical discussion with one of the local cowboys. Evangeline became acutely aware that she was being watched, that her response would be remembered and discussed long after she returned to the boarding house. Pride, the Harrow family, pride that her father had always said was their greatest asset, rose in her chest like a tide. This man was trying to embarrass her, to make her look foolish in front of the very people she needed to respect her authority. Well, she'd received the finest education money could buy, and she wasn't about to be shown up by some ranch hand who'd probably never set foot in a real library. "Anyone can claim to have read something," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet. True education requires more than simply turning pages. It requires understanding, analysis, the ability to engage with complex ideas in their original language. She lifted her chin and looked directly into those unsettling blue eyes. "If you're so smart, speak Latin." The words hung in the air like a challenge thrown down at a duel. The crowd pressed closer, sensing drama. Even the blacksmith had stopped his hammering to listen. For a long moment, the tall cowboy simply looked at her. Then, without ceremony or flourish, he spoke. "Amor vincit omnia, sed nos sidamus amori." His pronunciation was flawless, not the halting, uncertain delivery of someone repeating half-remembered phrases, but the smooth, confident Latin of someone who truly understood the language. The words themselves were beautiful, flowing like poetry from his lips. But it was more than just correct pronunciation. There was something in the way he said it, a depth of meaning that suggested he wasn't simply reciting, but truly speaking the ancient language. The crowd stood in absolute silence. Evangeline felt the blood drain from her face as the full impact of what had just happened hit her. She'd challenged him publicly, expecting to humiliate him, and instead he'd responded with Latin so perfect it would have impressed her professors at finishing school. "Love conquers all, but let us yield to love," he translated quietly, his eyes never leaving hers. "Virgil wrote that, though I always thought it was more complicated than most folks give it credit for." Someone in the crowd released a long, low whistle. Samuel Milliken cleared his throat uncomfortably. The blacksmith's hammer resumed its steady ringing, but it sounded different now, like a bell tolling the end of something. Evangeline stood frozen, her parasol suddenly feeling absurdly delicate in her hand, her leather portfolio with its important documents reduced to meaningless props. She'd come to Belmare, believing she understood the world and her place in it. She'd assumed that education and refinement were visible qualities, that intelligence and worth could be measured by appearance and social position. In the space of a few perfectly pronounced Latin words, all of those assumptions had crumbled to dust. The cowboy touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that managed to be both respectful and final. "Hope you have a good day, miss," he said simply, then turned and walked away, leading his horse toward the edge of town. The crowd began to disperse slowly, the men drifting back to their various occupations with the satisfied air of people who'd witnessed something memorable. Evangeline remained where she was, watching the tall figure disappear into the shimmering heat of the prairie. She'd won countless debates in the drawing rooms of St. Louis, impressed professors with her quick wit and elegant arguments. But standing in the dust of a frontier town, she'd just suffered the most complete intellectual defeat of her life at the hands of a man she'd dismissed as beneath her notice. Hidden somewhere in his belongings, she would later learn, was a worn copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, its pages soft with handling and marked with careful annotations in the margins. But for now, all she knew was that nothing in her expensive education had prepared her for this moment, when her most basic assumptions about the world had been shattered by 4 words of perfect Latin. Evangeline spent the remainder of that morning in a state of bewildered distraction, going through the motions of inspecting the ranch property, while her mind remained fixed on those 4 words of flawless Latin. She'd found the new cattle operation exactly where the maps indicated, a well-maintained spread, with sturdy fences and healthy-looking livestock, but she'd been unable to focus properly on the business at hand. The foreman her father had hired turned out to be a competent man named Williams, who knew his work well enough, but every time he spoke about breeding schedules or pasture rotation, Evangeline found herself thinking about the tall cowboy's voice, speaking ancient poetry with the casual confidence of a scholar. By the time she returned to town, word of the morning's encounter had spread with the efficiency that only small communities could manage. Mrs. Henderson greeted her at the boarding house with barely concealed curiosity, and the men at dinner that evening seemed to regard her with a mixture of newfound respect and gentle amusement. "Heard you met Colt McRae this morning," said Jim Crawford, the bearded rancher, as he passed the potatoes. "Interesting fellow. That one. McCrae," Evangeline repeated, filing away the name. "He works one of the local ranches. Several of them, actually. Best hand with difficult horses you'll find in 3 counties. Quiet sort, keeps to himself mostly, but there's not a rancher around here who wouldn't hire him if they could get him. He seems unusually well-spoken for his profession," Evangeline said carefully, unwilling to admit how thoroughly the encounter had unsettled her. Crawford chuckled. "That's one way to put it. Nobody knows much about where he came from originally. Showed up about 2 years ago, took work with old Morrison, and just kind of stayed. But he's got a way of surprising folks." After dinner, Evangeline retreated to her room and tried to concentrate on her correspondence, but the letters to her father seemed stilted and incomplete. How could she explain that her first day of business had been overshadowed by a philosophical discussion with a ranch hand? How could she describe the way her certainties had crumbled under the weight of perfect Latin pronunciation? She'd been raised to believe that breeding and education created clear distinctions between people, that a man's station in life was visible in his manners, his speech, his knowledge of the proper subjects. Colt McCrae, even his name sounded like something from a dime novel, had shattered those beliefs as easily as breaking kindling. The next morning brought her first real glimpse of him at work. She'd risen early and walked to the edge of town, ostensibly to review some boundary markers, but really because she hoped to understand more about the man who'd so thoroughly disrupted her worldview. She found him in a corral behind the livery stable, working with a horse that was clearly giving him trouble. The animal, a large bay gelding, was dancing and snorting, its eyes rolling white with fear or anger. Most men would have resorted to force, using ropes and harsh words to subdue such resistance. Instead, Colt moved with infinite patience, his voice a low, steady murmur that seemed to reach something deep in the animal's mind. He held a hand-carved chess set, balanced on the top rail of the corral, white and black pieces crafted with surprising artistry, the knights' heads detailed enough to show individual features, the bishop's robes flowing in miniature folds. Evangeline watched from a distance as he worked, noting the way he never raised his voice or made sudden movements. There was something almost musical in his approach, a rhythm that the horse gradually began to match. After 20 minutes of patient work, the gelding allowed him to approach, then to touch its neck, then finally to slip a bridle over its head. "Beautiful work," she found herself saying, stepping closer to the fence. Colt looked up, apparently unsurprised by her presence. "He's not mean," he said, stroking the horse's neck, "just afraid. Somebody used harsh methods on him before I got here." "I meant the chess set," Evangeline said, gesturing toward the carved pieces. "Did you make that?" For the first time since she'd met him, she saw something that might have been embarrassment cross his features. "Winter evenings get long," he said simply. "Man needs something to keep his hands busy." She moved closer, studying the intricate carving work. Each piece was perfectly proportioned, the details so fine they must have taken hours to complete. This wasn't the rough whittling she might have expected from a ranch hand killing time. This was genuine artistry, the work of someone with both skill and patience. "Do you play?" she asked. "Some." He lifted the set down from the fence rail, his large hands handling the delicate pieces with surprising gentleness. "Though it's hard to find opponents out here, most folks think it's a waste of time." "I learned at finishing school," Evangeline said, then immediately regretted the words. They sounded pretentious, a reminder of the social gulf between them that yesterday's Latin exchange had temporarily bridged. But Colt simply nodded. "Would you like to play?" The question caught her off guard. Everything in her upbringing screamed that it would be improper. A lady of her station didn't socialize with hired hands, especially not in public, where the entire town could observe and judge. But something in his quiet manner, in the careful way he handled the chess pieces, made her hesitate. "I suppose one game wouldn't hurt," she heard herself saying. He set up the board on a makeshift table formed by placing a flat board across two sawhorses. The pieces looked even more beautiful up close, and she realized that each set had been carved from different woods, the white pieces from pale pine, the black from rich walnut. The contrast was striking, and the craftsmanship was genuinely impressive. "You take white," Colt said, settling onto a wooden crate that served as his chair. Evangeline perched carefully on a second crate, acutely aware that anyone passing by would see Miss Harrow from St. Louis playing chess with a cowboy in the dust behind the livery stable. But as soon as she made her opening move, such concerns faded into the background. Colt played chess the way he worked with horses, patiently, thoughtfully, with a strategic depth that became apparent only gradually. His opening move seemed conventional enough, but by the middle game, Evangeline realized she was facing an opponent whose understanding of the board was far more sophisticated than her own. At finishing school, she'd been considered quite good at chess. She'd beaten most of her classmates, and even given her instructor some challenging games. But Colt approached each position like a puzzle to be solved, seeing combinations and possibilities that remained invisible to her until after he'd executed them. "You're very good at this," she said after he'd captured her bishop with a knight fork she hadn't seen coming. "Had a good teacher," he replied, studying the board with intense concentration. "Chess teaches you to think ahead, to consider consequences, useful skill for working with animals. Animals, horses, cattle, they think differently than people, but they do think. You have to anticipate their reactions, understand what they're likely to do before they do it." He moved his rook to support an advancing pawn. Same principle. Evangeline found herself genuinely engaged for the first time since arriving in Belmare. The chess game became a conversation conducted in moves and countermoves, a way of communicating that transcended the social barriers that normally kept them apart. When Colt spoke about strategy or tactical possibilities, his voice took on the same quiet confidence she'd heard when he spoke Latin. "Where did you learn to play like this?" she asked as the game progressed. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. His expression grew distant, and his fingers traced the edge of one of the carved pawns. "My father taught me," he said finally. "He believed chess was one of the great equalizers. Didn't matter where you came from or what you looked like. On the board, intelligence and patience were the only things that counted." There was something in his tone that suggested a deeper story, layers of meaning she couldn't quite grasp. But before she could ask another question, he moved his queen into position and said quietly, "Checkmate." Evangeline stared at the board, trying to trace back the sequence of moves that had led to her defeat. She'd been so focused on their conversation that she'd missed the trap he'd been setting for the last 6 moves. "Well played," she said, and meant it. "You've got good instincts," Colt replied, carefully packing the pieces back into their wooden box. "Just need to trust them more. Sometimes the obvious move isn't the right move." As he spoke, Evangeline realized they were no longer talking only about chess. There was something in his words that seemed to apply to larger questions, to the assumptions and choices that had brought her to this dusty frontier town. "I should get back," she said, suddenly aware that they'd been talking for over an hour and that several townspeople had passed by, noting her presence with varying degrees of interest. Colt nodded and stood, tucking the chess set under his arm. "Thank you for the game, Miss Harrow. Thank you for challenging me," she replied, the words carrying more meaning than a simple acknowledgement of their chess match. As she walked back toward the boarding house, Evangeline found herself thinking not about the game she'd lost, but about the man who'd won it. Everything about Colt McCrae contradicted her expectations, from his perfect Latin to his artistic chess set to his patient way with frightened horses. He was like a puzzle himself, one that couldn't be solved by the simple categories she'd always used to organize the world. And for the first time in her carefully ordered life, she found herself genuinely curious about something or someone that lay outside the boundaries of her proper, educated world. 3 days after the chess game, Evangeline found herself walking the main street of Belmare with a growing sense of restlessness. She'd completed her initial property assessments, written detailed reports for her father, and established working relationships with the local businessmen who would be essential to his expansion plans. By all measures, her mission was proceeding smoothly. Yet she couldn't stop thinking about Colt McCrae. She'd caught glimpses of him around town, leading horses to the blacksmith, loading supplies at Milliken's store, talking quietly with other ranch hands, but their paths hadn't crossed directly since their chess match. Each time she saw him, she found herself studying his movements, looking for clues to the contradiction he represented. Her mother's cameo brooch, pinned carefully to the collar of her traveling dress, seemed to catch the light differently in Belmare's harsh sun. The delicate piece had been a gift on her 18th birthday, carved with the profile of a Greek goddess and set in gold that had been in the Harrow family for 3 generations. It represented everything she'd been raised to value: refinement, tradition, proper breeding. But lately, the brooch felt like a weight against her throat, a reminder of expectations that suddenly seemed less important than they had a week ago. She was walking past the schoolhouse, a small, weathered building that served the handful of children in town, when she heard a familiar voice through the open windows. Curiosity overcame propriety, and she moved closer to listen. "And that's why the Romans built their roads so straight," Colt was saying. "They understood that the shortest distance between 2 points was a line, but more than that, they knew that straight roads meant faster communication, better trade, stronger empire." Evangeline peered through the window and saw him standing at the front of the classroom, a slate board covered with simple diagrams behind him. A dozen children sat at rough wooden desks, their faces rapt with attention. The regular schoolmaster, she remembered hearing, had taken ill, and apparently Colt had volunteered to fill in for the day. "But Mr. McCrae," piped up a girl of perhaps 10 years, "if the Romans were so smart, why aren't they still around?" Colt smiled, and Evangeline was surprised by how the expression transformed his face. "That's an excellent question, Sarah. What do you think happened to them?" The children offered various theories: wars, diseases, bad weather, while Colt listened with the same patient attention he'd shown the frightened horse. He guided their discussion without lecturing, helping them discover answers rather than simply providing them. "The truth is," he said finally, "the Romans forgot some of the things that made them strong. They stopped listening to new ideas, stopped adapting to changes. They thought their way was the only way, and when the world changed around them, they couldn't change with it." One of the older boys raised his hand. "Is that why you know so much about them, because you study what went wrong?" "Partly," Colt replied, "but mostly I study them because they built beautiful things and wrote beautiful words, and beauty doesn't disappear just because the people who made it are gone. When you read Marcus Aurelius or Virgil, you're talking to men who lived 2,000 years ago. Death couldn't silence them." Evangeline felt something twist in her chest at his words. There was a depth of longing in his voice, a reverence for learning that she'd heard echoed in her own professors' voices at finishing school. But those professors had been surrounded by libraries and lecture halls, supported by institutions and traditions. What must it be like to carry such love for knowledge into a world that had no use for it? The lesson continued for another 20 minutes, ranging from Roman engineering to Latin poetry to the mathematical principles behind bridge construction. Colt spoke easily about subjects that most frontier children would never encounter, but he did it in ways that made the ideas accessible and interesting. When the children finally filed out for their lunch break, chattering excitedly about aqueducts and gladiators, Evangeline found herself standing alone outside the schoolhouse as Colt emerged. "Miss Harrow," he said, touching his hat brim in his customary greeting. "Didn't expect to see you here. I was curious about the lesson," she admitted. The children seemed very engaged. "They're smart kids. Just need someone to show them that learning can be interesting instead of just memorizing facts." He closed the schoolhouse door behind him. Most of them won't get much formal education, so I try to give them a taste of what's out there. You volunteer to teach? When needed. Mrs. Patterson usually handles it, but she's been under the weather. He adjusted the books under his arm. She could see the worn spine of what looked like a volume of Emerson's essays. Not much call for classical education in cattle country. There was no bitterness in his voice, but Evangeline caught an undertone of resignation that made her want to ask questions she had no right to ask. Instead, she found herself saying, "I couldn't help but notice that you were reading Emerson." Colt glanced down at the book. Self-reliance seemed appropriate for this part of the world. "A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds," Evangeline quoted, "adored by little statesmen and philosophers and divines. With consistency, a great soul has simply nothing to do." Colt continued the passage. "He may as well concern himself with his shadow on the wall." They stood looking at each other in the afternoon sun, the shared quotation hanging between them like a bridge across the gulf of their different worlds. Evangeline realized she was holding her breath. "Would you like to borrow it?" Colt asked finally. "When I'm finished." The offer was so unexpected that she almost laughed. "I have my own copy, thank you. I brought several books with me from St. Louis." "What kind of books?" "Poetry, mostly. Tennyson, Browning, some novels I'm particularly fond of, Jane Austen." She paused, then added impulsively, "What do you read, besides Emerson and Marcus Aurelius?" "Whatever I can find. Shakespeare, when I can get it, though the comedies work better than the tragedies out here. Thoreau, though his ideas about simple living are easier to practice on the frontier than they probably were in Massachusetts." He shifted the book to his other hand. "Sometimes I think Walden Pond would seem like a crowded city after a month alone on the range." Evangeline found herself genuinely curious about his reading habits, about the inner life that such reading implied. "Where do you find books? There's no library in Belmare." "I pick them up when I can, trade for them sometimes. There's a traveling preacher who comes through twice a year with a trunk full of books he's collected. Most folks want the Bible stories, but he's usually got other things too." Colt's expression grew slightly wistful. "Found a copy of Paradise Lost that way. Took me 3 months to work through it, but it was worth every page." "Milton," Evangeline said softly. "That's not exactly light reading." "No, but beautiful. All that language about light and darkness, good and evil, it makes you think about what those words really mean." He paused, seeming to consider whether to continue. "Sometimes when I'm out on night watch, with nothing but stars and cattle for company, I think about Satan's speech in the first book. Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. Makes you wonder what freedom really costs." The conversation was moving into territory that felt both intimate and dangerous. Evangeline could see neighbors watching from across the street, could imagine the gossip that would follow if she was seen having extended philosophical discussions with a ranch hand. But something in Colt's manner, the careful way he spoke about ideas that clearly mattered to him, made it impossible to simply walk away. "You sound like you miss it," she said. "Academic discussion, I mean." "Sometimes." His answer was honest but guarded. "Though I've learned there are different kinds of wisdom. Books teach you what people have thought, but working with animals and weather and land teaches you things books can't. Both matter." Before Evangeline could respond, a voice called her name from across the street. Mrs. Henderson was waving from the boarding house porch, probably wondering why her genteel guest was lingering in conversation with one of the local cowboys. "I should go," Evangeline said reluctantly. "Of course." Colt stepped aside to let her pass. "Enjoy your Tennyson, Miss Harrow." As she walked toward the boarding house, Evangeline found herself thinking about the cameo brooch at her throat. 3 generations of Harrow women had worn it, each of them moving through lives carefully circumscribed by social expectations and proper behavior. But for the first time, those expectations felt less like protection and more like a cage. That evening, she sat in her room reading In Memoriam, but Tennyson's elegant verses about loss and memory kept giving way to thoughts of Colt's voice, quoting Emerson, Of his patient way with children and frightened animals, of the longing she'd heard when he spoke about Paradise Lost. She was discovering that assumptions could be dangerous things, not just the assumptions she'd made about him, but the assumptions she'd always made about herself and what she wanted from life. The cameo brooch sat on her dresser, catching the lamplight like a reminder of everything she was supposed to be. But in the growing darkness outside her window, she could hear the sounds of a frontier town settling into evening, and for the first time since arriving in Belmare, those sounds didn't seem foreign or frightening. They seemed like possibilities. 2 weeks into her stay in Belmare, Evangeline found herself in an unexpected position, working alongside Colt McRae on plans for expanding the cattle operation. What had begun as a formal business consultation had evolved into something resembling a partnership, though she wasn't entirely sure how the transformation had occurred. It started when Williams, the foreman her father had hired, suffered a broken leg in a fall from his horse. With the man laid up for at least a month, Evangeline had needed someone knowledgeable about cattle and land management to help her evaluate potential improvements to the ranch. Several people had recommended Colt, and despite her reservations about the propriety of the arrangement, she'd found herself asking for his assistance. Now, 3 days into their collaboration, she was beginning to understand why every rancher in the territory would hire him if they could. His knowledge of cattle, grass, water sources, and weather patterns was encyclopedic, but more than that, he had an intuitive understanding of how all these elements worked together. When he talked about rotating pastures or timing breeding seasons, he spoke with the authority of someone who'd observed and understood the subtle patterns that governed life on the range. They were sitting on the porch of the ranch house, spread maps and notebooks scattered between them on a makeshift table formed by placing boards across 2 wooden crates. The afternoon heat shimmered across the grassland, but a slight breeze made the shade tolerable. Evangeline had long since abandoned her parasol and gloves, finding them impractical for the detailed work of marking fence lines and calculating carrying capacity. The north pasture could support maybe 50 more head if we improve the water access, Colt was saying, tracing a route on the map with his finger. There's a spring about a mile from the main grazing area, but it would need a proper channel to make it useful. Evangeline studied the topographical lines, trying to visualize the terrain she'd ridden over that morning. Would that be expensive? Depends on how you define expensive. Materials would cost some, but mostly it's labor. Dig the channel, lay some stone to prevent erosion, build a simple dam to create a waterhole. He glanced up from the map. I could do most of the work myself, if your father's willing to hire me for it. The casual way he mentioned working for her father made Evangeline realize how much their relationship had changed in just a few days. They'd moved from stilted formal exchanges to the kind of practical collaboration that felt almost natural. She found herself looking forward to their daily planning sessions, not just for the work they accomplished, but for the conversations that developed around the work. "You understand business better than I expected," she said, then immediately regretted the words. They sounded condescending, a reminder of her initial prejudices. But Colt simply smiled. Running cattle is a business, whether you're doing it on 100 acres or 10,000. Same principles apply: costs, profits, planning for the future. Did you learn that from books too? Some of it, but mostly from watching ranchers make mistakes. He picked up a pressed wildflower that had been serving as a bookmark in his copy of Emerson, a simple prairie flower with delicate yellow petals that had been carefully preserved. Between pages of Nature. Amazing how many smart men can lose money on cattle because they forget that cows are living animals, not just numbers on a ledger. Evangeline found herself studying the pressed flower, noting the care with which it had been preserved. There was something touching about a man who would take time to press wildflowers between the pages of philosophy. It suggested a sensitivity that seemed at odds with his rough exterior, yet somehow perfectly consistent with everything else she'd learned about him. "May I ask you something personal?" she said impulsively. Colt looked up from the maps, his expression cautious but not unwelcoming. "You can ask, why are you here? I mean, why are you working cattle ranches when you're clearly educated enough to do other things?" For a long moment, he didn't answer. His fingers traced the edge of the pressed flower, and she could see him weighing how much to reveal. "Sometimes life doesn't give you the choices you expect," he said finally. "Sometimes you have to choose between what you want and what you need to survive." There was pain in his voice, carefully controlled, but unmistakable. Evangeline found herself wanting to ask more, to understand what had brought such obvious intelligence and education to this remote frontier, but something in his manner warned her not to push. Instead, she said quietly, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to pry." "No, he stopped, seeming to reconsider his words. "It's just not a simple story." They returned to their work, but the atmosphere had shifted subtly. There was a new awareness between them, an acknowledgement that their relationship had moved beyond the purely professional. When Colt leaned over to point out a detail on the map, Evangeline became acutely conscious of his proximity, the scent of leather and prairie wind that clung to his clothes, the careful way his large hands handled the delicate papers. "What about you?" he asked suddenly. "Why are you really here?" "I told you. My father sent me to oversee his business interests." "That's what you're doing?" I asked. "Why you're here?" His blue eyes met hers directly. "Seems like there are easier ways for a banker's daughter to spend her time than evaluating cattle ranches in frontier towns." The question caught her off guard, partly because she'd been asking herself the same thing lately. "My father believes I have a good head for business. He wanted someone he could trust to handle this expansion. And you wanted to prove he was right." It wasn't a question, and the certainty in his voice made her defensive. "What's wrong with wanting to prove yourself capable?" "Nothing at all. I just wonder if you're trying to prove it to him or to yourself." The observation hit closer to home than she wanted to admit. For weeks now, she'd been telling herself that this assignment was about demonstrating her value to her father's business empire. But sitting here in the afternoon heat, working alongside a man who challenged every assumption she'd ever held about intelligence and worth, she was beginning to suspect her motivations were more complicated than that. "Maybe both," she admitted. "Nothing wrong with that either," Colt said gently. "Sometimes the hardest person to convince is yourself." They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the maps and notebooks spreading between them like a bridge between their different worlds. When Evangeline looked up, she realized the sun had moved considerably lower in the sky, casting longer shadows across the grassland. "We should probably head back to town," she said reluctantly. As they gathered their materials, Colt's hand brushed against hers while reaching for one of the notebooks. The contact was brief and accidental, but it sent an unexpected shock through her system. She looked up to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Miss Harrow," he said quietly. "Yes? I want you to know that these conversations, this work we're doing, it means something to me. It's been a long time since I could talk to someone about ideas, about plans that matter." His honesty was so complete, so unguarded, that it took her breath away. In her world, people approach such declarations through layers of indirection and social ritual, but Colt simply said what he meant, without artifice or calculation. "It means something to me too," she found herself saying. "More than I expected." They stood looking at each other in the fading light, and Evangeline felt the weight of everything unsaid hanging between them. Then Colt stepped back, breaking the spell. "We should get you back before folks start worrying," he said, his voice carefully neutral again. The ride back to town was quiet, but it was a different kind of silence than they'd shared before, charged with possibilities, and weighted with the awareness that something fundamental had shifted between them. When they reached the boarding house, Colt helped her down from the wagon with his customary courtesy, but his hands lingered on her waist a moment longer than strictly necessary. "Thank you for today," Evangeline said as she gathered her skirts. "Thank you for trusting me with the work," he replied. "Your father's lucky to have someone who cares as much as you do." As she watched him drive away, Evangeline realized that for the first time since arriving in Belmare, she'd forgotten to think about what the townspeople might say about her spending the day alone with Colt McRae. The realization should have alarmed her, but instead it felt like a kind of freedom. That evening, she sat on the boarding house porch as dusk settled over the town, watching the lights come on in windows up and down the main street. The pressed wildflower from Colt's book had somehow ended up in her pocket, and she found herself turning it over in her fingers, thinking about a man who could quote Emerson while planning cattle rotations, who pressed flowers between pages of philosophy, who saw beauty in the simplest things. For the first time in her carefully ordered life, Evangeline was beginning to understand that there might be different kinds of education, different forms of wisdom, and that the most important lessons might not come from books at all. The letter from her father arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by the weekly mail stage, with its familiar seal and her father's precise handwriting. Evangeline recognized the tone before she'd finished reading the first paragraph. Theodore Harrow was not pleased with reports he'd been receiving about his daughter's activities in Belmare. "It has come to my attention," the letter read, "that you have been spending considerable time in the company of one of the local ranch hands, working on matters that should properly be handled by the foreman I specifically hired for this purpose. While I appreciate your dedication to the business, I must remind you that maintaining proper social distinctions is essential to establishing our family's authority in the region." Evangeline set the letter down on her small writing desk and stared out the window at the main street below. Someone had been writing to her father, reporting on her activities with obvious disapproval. The knowledge shouldn't have surprised her. Small towns thrived on gossip, and her collaboration with Colt had hardly been secret, but it stung nonetheless. The letter continued with instructions to limit her contact with local employees to formal business matters, and a pointed reminder that her reputation reflected on the entire Harrow family. It concluded with news that her father planned to visit Belmare within the month to review progress personally. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in her portfolio, but the words continued to echo in her mind. Proper social distinctions, authority, reputation, all the things she'd been raised to value, suddenly feeling like chains around her ankles. That afternoon, she met Colt at the ranch as planned, but she found it difficult to concentrate on their work. He noticed her distraction almost immediately. "Something wrong?" he asked as they reviewed the plans for the water channel project. "My father wrote. He'll be visiting soon to inspect the progress." It wasn't exactly a lie, though it omitted the parts of the letter that had truly troubled her. Colt nodded, but she could see something change in his expression, a subtle withdrawal, as if he were preparing himself for disappointment. "I suppose that means our arrangement will be ending soon. Why would you think that?" "Because when your father gets here, he'll want to see his daughter working with people of appropriate standing." The word came out carefully, but she could hear the bitter understanding beneath it. "A man like Theodore Harrow doesn't hire his equals to work cattle." The casual way he spoke her father's name caught her attention. "You know my father?" Colt was quiet for a long moment, his hands still on the maps spread between them. "I know of him. His reputation reaches pretty far, even out here." There was something in his tone that made her study his face more carefully. "What kind of reputation?" "The kind that gets things done, regardless of who gets hurt in the process." He looked up at her directly. "Your father's a powerful man, Miss Harrow. Powerful men usually get what they want." Before she could ask what he meant by that, Colt reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a worn pocket watch. The case was silver, tarnished with age and use, and when he opened it, she could see an inscription on the inner cover. The words were in Latin, engraved in elegant script, "Tempus fugit, amor manet." "Time flies, love remains," she translated softly. "It belonged to my father," Colt said, his voice carefully controlled. "He was a professor of classics at a small college back east. Not wealthy, not powerful, but he believed in things like truth and justice and the value of knowledge. Evangeline felt something cold settle in her stomach. Was? He died 5 years ago, lost his position first, then his health, then everything else. Colt's fingers traced the inscription on the watch. Turns out that when powerful men want something, professors of classics don't have much power to stop them. The pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known she was solving began to fall into place. What happened? The college owned some land that a railroad company wanted. The college president was prepared to sell at a fair price, but my father and a few other professors raised questions about the deal. They'd noticed irregularities in the paperwork, suspected that someone was getting paid twice for the same land. Colt snapped the watch closed and returned it to his pocket. They were right, but asking questions about powerful men's business deals turned out to be dangerous. My father and his colleagues found themselves accused of various improprieties, dismissed from their positions, blacklisted from other institutions. That's terrible, but surely there were legal remedies. Legal remedies require money and influence, Colt said quietly. Things my father didn't have. The men he'd opposed did. By the time the truth came out, my father had spent everything he had trying to clear his name. The stress killed him. Evangeline sat in stunned silence, beginning to understand the pain she'd heard in his voice when he talked about choosing between what you wanted and what you needed to survive. So you came west. Seemed like a good place to disappear, and I discovered I had a talent for working with animals, simpler than working with people in some ways. Animals don't lie about who they are. The revelation explained so much about Colt: his education, his knowledge of business, his careful way of speaking about power and authority. But it also raised questions that made her stomach clench with apprehension. What was the name of the railroad company? She asked, though she was afraid she already knew the answer. Harrow and Associates Railroad Development Company, Colt said quietly. Your father's company. The words hit her like a physical blow. She felt the blood drain from her face as the implications became clear. Colt knew exactly who she was, who her father was, what the Harrow name represented. And he'd been working with her anyway, helping her with plans that would ultimately benefit the man who'd destroyed his father's life. You knew, she whispered. All this time, you knew who I was. I knew. Then why did you help me? Why did you... She couldn't finish the question, couldn't voice the growing attraction that had been building between them, the connection she'd thought was genuine. Because you're not your father, Colt said simply, and because I wanted to believe that maybe things could be different. The honesty in his voice was devastating. He'd known from the beginning what it would cost him to get close to her, and he'd done it anyway. While she'd been discovering that her assumptions about frontier life were wrong, he'd been hoping against experience that his assumptions about the Harrow family might be wrong too. I'm sorry, she said, the words feeling completely inadequate. I'm so sorry about your father, about what happened to him. Not your fault, Colt replied. You were probably still in finishing school when all that was happening. But it felt like her fault. Every acre her father had acquired, every business deal that had built their family's wealth, suddenly seemed tainted with the possibility of similar injustices. How many other families had been destroyed by Theodore Harrow's relentless pursuit of profit? I should go, she said, standing abruptly and beginning to gather her papers. Miss Harrow. No, I should go. I shouldn't have. She couldn't form coherent sentences. The shame was too overwhelming, the weight of her family name suddenly too heavy to bear. But as she turned to leave, Colt caught her hand gently. Don't let his choices define who you are, he said quietly. You're not responsible for what happened before you were old enough to understand it. She looked down at their joined hands, his rough and calloused from honest work, hers soft from a lifetime of privilege built on others' suffering. The contrast seemed to summarize everything wrong with the world. How can you even stand to look at me? She whispered. Because when I look at you, I see someone who cares about doing the right thing, someone who treats people fairly, regardless of their station, someone who pressed a wildflower in a book of poetry because she thought it was beautiful. His thumb traced across her knuckles. I see someone who's nothing like her father. The tenderness in his voice was her undoing. For the first time since arriving in Belmare, Evangeline began to cry, not the delicate tears of a lady overcome by vapors, but the deep, wrenching sobs of someone whose entire understanding of herself had been shattered and rebuilt in the space of a single conversation. Colt let her cry, his hand steady on hers, offering comfort without judgment. When the tears finally subsided, he helped her to the wagon and drove her back to town in silence that felt both painful and healing. As they reached the boarding house, he finally spoke again. "Your father's visit doesn't have to change anything between us, unless you want it to." "Everything's changed," Evangeline said softly. "I don't even know who I am anymore." "You're the woman who chose to see past appearances," Colt replied. "The woman who's brave enough to question what she's been taught. That hasn't changed." But as she watched him drive away, Evangeline wasn't sure she felt brave at all. She felt lost, unmoored from everything she'd believed about her family, her life, her purpose. The pocket watch inscription echoed in her mind. "Time flies, love remains." The question was whether love could survive the weight of truth. Evangeline spent the next 3 days in a state of emotional turmoil, torn between her growing feelings for Colt and the devastating knowledge of what her father had done to his family. She found herself questioning everything, every business deal, every land acquisition, every aspect of the wealth and privilege she'd taken for granted her entire life. It was Mrs. Henderson who inadvertently provided the key to understanding the full scope of her father's activities in Belmare. "Shame about the Morrison place," the boarding house keeper said over breakfast on Friday morning, refilling Evangeline's coffee cup with her usual maternal care. "Tom Morrison worked that land for 15 years, built it up from nothing, thought he'd die there." Evangeline looked up from her barely touched eggs. "I understood, mister. Morrison sold the property willingly to my father's company." "Willingly might be a strong word," Mrs. Henderson said carefully. "Tom's a proud man, wouldn't want folks to know the whole story. But the bank called in his loan mighty sudden-like, right after your father's representatives started sniffing around his property. Coincidence, maybe, but—" She shrugged, leaving the implication hanging. "What kind of coincidence?" Mrs. Henderson glanced around the dining room, ensuring they weren't overheard. "Well, Tom had been making his payments regular as clockwork for 10 years. Never missed one, never even been late. Then all of a sudden the bank says there's some problem with the original paperwork, some clause about immediate repayment if certain conditions weren't met." A cold weight settled in Evangeline's stomach. "What conditions?" "Something about maintaining minimum livestock numbers, which was strange because Tom's herd had been growing every year. But when the bank assessor came out to count cattle, somehow the numbers came up short." Mrs. Henderson's expression suggested what she thought about the reliability of that count. "Tom tried to fight it, but legal battles cost money he didn't have. In the end, selling to your father was the only way to avoid complete bankruptcy." Evangeline set down her coffee cup with hands that had begun to tremble. "And the bank that called in the loan?" "First National of Kansas City. Same bank that's been financing your father's other land purchases in the region." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Her father hadn't simply been buying available property. He'd been creating the availability through financial manipulation and legal pressure. The Morrison Ranch was just one example of what was probably a systematic campaign to acquire land through coercion rather than honest commerce. After breakfast, Evangeline retreated to her room and retrieved her father's correspondence from the locked portfolio. Reading the letters with new understanding, she began to see patterns that had escaped her notice before. References to expediting acquisitions and resolving ownership complications took on sinister new meanings. A letter dated 3 weeks earlier mentioned finalizing the arrangements with the local banking representative and expressed satisfaction that resistance to our expansion has been largely eliminated. Her hands shook as she found the specific document she was looking for, a copy of the deed for the Morrison property. The paperwork appeared perfectly legal, but now she understood the pressure tactics that had made the sale voluntary. A soft knock at her door interrupted her investigation. When she opened it, she found Samuel Milliken standing in the hallway, his hat in his hands, and his expression troubled. "Miss Harrow, I'm sorry to disturb you, but there's something I think you should know. Something I probably should have told you when you first arrived." She stepped aside to let him enter, her heart already racing with apprehension about what new revelation might be coming. "It's about the land purchases your father's been making," Milliken said without preamble, "and about some documents well, that aren't exactly what they appear to be." "What do you mean?" Milliken reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded paper. "This is a copy of the original deed for the Morrison property, the one Tom Morrison signed 15 years ago when he bought the land." Evangeline unfolded the document and studied it carefully. It looked standard enough, but Milliken pointed to a specific clause near the bottom of the page. "See this section about livestock requirements? That clause wasn't in the original deed Tom signed. It was added later, after your father's representatives had time to examine the property and identify ways to create leverage." "Added how?" "Forgery," Milliken said bluntly. "Very good forgery, but forgery nonetheless. I know because I witnessed Tom's original signature, and I can see where new text has been inserted using slightly different ink and handwriting." The room seemed to spin around Evangeline as the implications hit her. This wasn't just aggressive business practice or even unethical financial pressure. This was outright fraud, criminal activity that violated both legal and moral boundaries. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked weakly. "Because there are 5 other properties your father's acquired in the past year using similar methods. And because there are rumors that he's planning to use the same tactics on the remaining independent ranches in the region." Milliken's expression was grim. "Including the ranch where Colt McRae works." Evangeline sank into the room's single chair, overwhelmed by the scope of her father's criminal enterprise. Everything she'd believed about their family's success had been built on a foundation of lies and theft. "Does Colt know?" she asked. "He suspects something. Most of the independent ranchers do, but they don't have proof, and they don't have the money to fight Theodore Harrow in court, even if they did." Milliken paused. "That's why I'm coming to you. You're the only person with both access to the real documentation and the power to do something about it." "What could I possibly do? I'm just—" "You're Theodore Harrow's daughter and his official representative in this region," Milliken interrupted. "If you were to discover irregularities in the land acquisitions and report them to the appropriate authorities, it would carry weight that accusations from local ranchers never could." The suggestion was both thrilling and terrifying. She had the power to stop her father's illegal activities, to prevent other families from suffering the fate of the Morrisons and the McRaes. But doing so would mean betraying her own family, destroying her father's business empire, and probably ending any possibility of a comfortable future for herself. "I need to think about this," she said finally. "Of course. But don't think too long. Your father's visit is only 2 weeks away, and there are signs he's planning to accelerate the acquisition process while he's here." After Milliken left, Evangeline sat alone in her room, staring at the forged deed and feeling the weight of an impossible choice settling on her shoulders. Everything she'd been raised to value, family loyalty, financial security, social position, pointed toward keeping silent about what she'd discovered. But everything she'd learned about justice and truth, everything Colt had taught her about seeing beyond surface appearances, demanded that she act. That evening, she walked to the edge of town and stood watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and crimson. The landscape that had seemed harsh and foreign when she first arrived now looked beautiful to her, full of possibility and honest struggle. She thought about Tom Morrison building his ranch from nothing, about Colt's father dying in poverty while fighting for truth, about all the families whose lives had been destroyed by Theodore Harrow's relentless pursuit of profit. The forged deed felt heavy in her hands as she made her decision. Some things were more important than family loyalty. Some principles were worth any sacrifice. When she returned to the boarding house, she began drafting 2 letters. The first was to the territorial authorities, formally reporting the fraudulent documents and requesting a full investigation of the land acquisitions. The second was to her father, informing him that his daughter had discovered the truth about his business practices and could no longer be part of them. By the time she finished writing, the moon had risen over Belmere, casting silver light across the town, where she'd discovered both love and the courage to fight for what was right. Tomorrow, she would send the letters and face the consequences. The little girl who had arrived from St. Louis 3 weeks ago, secure in her assumptions about family and society, was gone forever. In her place sat a woman who understood that real education meant learning to choose conscience over comfort, and that true love sometimes required risking everything you thought you wanted for everything you knew was right. The response to Evangeline's letters came faster than she'd expected. Within 4 days, a federal marshal arrived in Belmere to begin investigating the land fraud allegations, and her father's telegram arrived, demanding an immediate explanation for what he called her inexplicable betrayal of family interests. Theodore Harrow would be arriving on the next stage a full week earlier than originally planned. Evangeline spent those intervening days in a strange state of suspended animation, knowing that her decision had set in motion events that would fundamentally alter the course of her life, but unable to predict exactly what form those changes would take. The resignation letter she'd written to formally sever her connection with her father's business sat on her dresser like a ticking bomb, waiting for the moment when she would have to deliver it in person. She'd seen little of Colt since revealing the truth about the forged documents to Marshal Henderson. The federal investigation required that potential witnesses avoid discussing the case among themselves, which meant that despite her desperate desire to talk to him about what was happening, she was forced to maintain a careful distance. But she could see him sometimes, working with horses near the livery stable or helping other ranchers prepare for what everyone understood would be a difficult confrontation with Theodore Harrow. There was something different about him now, a tension in his movements, a watchfulness in his expression that suggested he was preparing for battle. The entire town seemed to be holding its breath. Word of the federal investigation had spread quickly, and suddenly, people who had been forced to sell their land to Harrow's representatives were coming forward with stories of pressure, tactics, and suspicious circumstances. The Silver Dollar Saloon had become an unofficial headquarters for comparing experiences and sharing evidence, and Evangeline could hear the low murmur of intense conversations whenever she passed by. Mrs. Henderson had been kindness itself throughout the ordeal, providing emotional support without asking intrusive questions. But even she seemed subdued, understanding that the young woman who had arrived as Theodore Harrow's daughter might not remain welcome in her boarding house much longer. "You're doing the right thing," she said on the morning of Theodore's expected arrival, setting a cup of coffee in front of Evangeline's untouched breakfast. "Takes courage to stand up to family when they're in the wrong." "I hope so," Evangeline replied, though privately she was struggling with doubts that seemed to multiply with each passing hour. "I keep wondering if there might have been another way, something that wouldn't require destroying everything." "Some things need destroying," Mrs. Henderson said firmly. "Better to tear down what's rotten and build something honest than to let the corruption spread." By noon, a crowd had gathered on the main street to await the stage. It wasn't a hostile crowd exactly, but there was an undercurrent of tension that made the air feel charged with possibility. These people had lived with the consequences of Theodore Harrow's business practices for months, and now they would finally have a chance to confront the man himself. Evangeline positioned herself on the boarding house porch, her resignation letter folded in her portfolio, and her hands clasped tightly to keep them from shaking. She'd chosen to wear her simplest dress, dark blue cotton, with minimal decoration, rather than the elaborate traveling costume she'd worn when first arriving in Belmere. The change felt symbolic, a physical representation of how much she'd changed during her time in the frontier town. The stage arrived punctually at 1 o'clock, raising the familiar cloud of dust that settled over everything like a blessing or a curse, depending on your perspective. Theodore Harrow emerged from the coach with his customary air of command, his expensive suit and gold watch chain marking him immediately as someone accustomed to wealth and deference. At 52, he remained an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered like Evangeline herself, with graying hair that added gravitas to his already commanding presence. He surveyed the assembled crowd with the calculating gaze of a man who saw everything in terms of profit and loss, opportunity and obstacle. "Evangeline," he said, spotting her on the porch and striding over with barely controlled anger, "I trust you have an explanation for this nonsense about federal investigations and fraudulent documents." She stood slowly, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes watching their reunion. "Hello, Father. Yes, I believe I can explain everything." "Then you can start by telling me why a federal marshal is examining documents that should be private business correspondence, and why my own daughter has apparently been cooperating with an investigation into her own family's affairs." The accusation in his voice was unmistakable, but Evangeline found that it bothered her less than she'd expected. Standing here in the town where she'd learned to see past surface appearances, facing the man whose criminal activities had destroyed families like the McRaes, she felt a clarity of purpose that surprised her with its strength. "Because those documents prove that you've been using forgery and fraud to steal land from honest families," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet street. "And because I couldn't continue to be part of it." Theodore's face darkened with a rage she'd rarely seen from him. "You ungrateful little fool. Everything I've built, everything our family has, comes from having the vision and courage to take opportunities that weaker men let slip away. These people," he gestured dismissively at the crowd, "these people would still be scratching out subsistence livings if men like me didn't bring progress and development to places like this." "Progress built on lies isn't progress," Evangeline replied. "It's just theft dressed up in fancy language." "And who taught you to think like that?" Theodore's eyes scanned the crowd, searching for targets for his anger. "Some local agitator who's been filling your head with romantic nonsense about noble poverty and honest labor." Before Evangeline could respond, Colt stepped forward from the crowd. He moved with the same quiet confidence she'd come to associate with him, but there was something harder in his expression now, something that spoke of old injuries and long-delayed justice. "Nobody had to teach her anything," he said calmly. "She figured out the truth on her own, because she's got more integrity in her little finger than you've got in your whole body." Theodore's attention fixed on Colt with the intensity of a predator recognizing a threat. "And you are Colt McRae, son of Professor Jonathan McRae, who died trying to expose your business practices 5 years ago." The recognition dawned slowly on Theodore's face, followed by something that might have been surprise or even grudging respect. "McRae, I remember that situation. Your father was an idealistic fool who didn't understand how business works in the real world." "My father was an honest man who refused to let criminals destroy people's lives for profit," Colt replied, his voice level but edged with steel. "Just like your daughter's doing now." The confrontation was drawing more spectators, and Evangeline realized that the moment she'd been dreading and anticipating for days had finally arrived. This wasn't just about her personal relationship with her father anymore. It was about everything she'd learned in Belmare, everything she'd discovered about justice and truth, and the courage to stand up for what was right. "Father," she said, pulling the resignation letter from her portfolio with hands that had finally stopped shaking. "I can't work for you anymore. I can't be part of a business that builds wealth by destroying other people's lives." Theodore stared at the letter as if it were a weapon pointed at his heart. "You're throwing away everything, Evangeline. Your future, your security, your family. For what? For these people who'll forget you the moment it's convenient? For the chance to sleep at night, knowing I didn't participate in something I knew was wrong," she replied. "For the chance to build something honest, instead of inheriting something rotten." As she handed him the letter, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. The scared young woman who had stepped off the stage 3 weeks ago was truly gone, replaced by someone who understood that real strength came not from power over others, but from the courage to do what was right, regardless of the cost. Theodore read the letter quickly, his expression growing darker with each line. When he finished, he looked up at his daughter with something that might have been genuine confusion. "You're serious about this? Completely serious? Then you're a bigger fool than your mother was," he said bitterly, "and just as naive about how the world really works." The insult to her mother's memory struck deeper than his anger at her own actions. But before Evangeline could respond, Marshal Henderson stepped forward from the crowd. "Mr. Harrow, I'm going to need you to come with me. There are some questions about your business practices that need answers." Theodore looked around the assembled crowd with the expression of a man who finally understood that his usual methods of intimidation and manipulation wouldn't work here. For the first time since Evangeline had known him, her father looked uncertain, even vulnerable. "This isn't over," he said quietly, though whether he was speaking to her, to Colt, or to the town in general wasn't clear. "No," Evangeline agreed, "but it's the beginning of something better." As she watched her father walk away with the federal marshal, she felt Colt's presence beside her, even before he spoke. "That took courage," he said softly. "It took too long," she replied. "I should have seen the truth sooner. Truth has its own timing. What matters is that you saw it when it counted." Standing there in the afternoon sun, surrounded by people who had accepted her transformation from Theodore Harrow's daughter into simply Evangeline, she realized that for the first time in her life, she was exactly where she belonged. The federal investigation moved quickly once Theodore Harrow was taken into custody. Within hours of his arrival in Belmare, Marshal Henderson had uncovered enough evidence of fraud and forgery to justify holding him for trial in the territorial capital. The local telegraph office worked overtime, sending messages to Kansas City, St. Louis, and Washington, as the scope of the Harrow business empire's illegal activities became clear. Evangeline found herself in the strange position of being both a key witness for the prosecution and the estranged daughter of the accused. The federal authorities needed her testimony about the documents she'd discovered, but they also had to navigate the delicate situation of asking a woman to testify against her own father. "You understand that your testimony could result in significant prison time for Mr. Harrow," Marshal Henderson explained during their first formal interview, "and that cooperating with this investigation will likely have serious consequences for your own financial situation." Evangeline sat in the boarding house parlor, which had been temporarily converted into an interview room, with her hands folded carefully in her lap. The weight of the decision felt enormous, but her resolve remained steady. "I understand completely," she replied, "but I also understand that my father's actions have destroyed families and livelihoods. If my testimony can prevent that from happening to others, then the personal cost doesn't matter." The marshal made notes in his official book, occasionally glancing up to study her face, as if trying to gauge her sincerity. "Miss Harrow, I have to ask, have you been influenced or coerced in any way to provide this testimony? Any threats, promises, or pressure from local residents?" The question clearly referred to Colt, though the marshal was too professional to mention him by name. Evangeline had expected this line of inquiry and had prepared her response carefully. "Marshal Henderson, I discovered the fraudulent documents before I learned about the personal connection between my father's business practices and Mr. McCrae's family history. My decision to report the crimes was based on evidence, not on personal relationships." "But you acknowledge that such a relationship exists?" Evangeline felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she met the marshal's gaze directly. "I acknowledge that Mr. McCrae and I have developed a friendship based on mutual respect and shared values. But that friendship is a consequence of my moral awakening, not the cause of it." After the interview, news arrived via telegraph that sent shockwaves through the town. The federal investigation had expanded beyond the Belmare land frauds to encompass Theodore Harrow's entire business empire. Similar patterns of forged documents and coercive tactics had been discovered in 3 other territories, involving dozens of properties and hundreds of thousands of dollars in fraudulent transactions. The scope of the crimes was staggering, but so were the implications for everyone who had been connected to Theodore's business dealings. Evangeline realized that her father's arrest would likely result in the seizure of most of the family assets, leaving her essentially penniless. The comfortable future she'd always taken for granted had vanished as completely as if it had never existed. That evening, she sat on the boarding house porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. The beauty of the scene felt like a gift, something that couldn't be bought or stolen or forged. For the first time since Theodore's arrest, she felt a sense of peace about her decision. "Beautiful evening." Colt's voice came from the street below, where he stood with his hat in his hands, like a suitor calling on his intended. "Yes, it is," she agreed, gesturing to the empty chair beside her. "Would you like to sit?" He climbed the steps and settled into the chair, his long legs stretched out in front of him. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the light fade from the sky and listening to the quiet sounds of the town settling into evening. "How are you holding up?" he asked finally. "Better than I expected," Evangeline admitted. "I thought I'd feel worse about everything. But mostly I feel relieved." "Relieved?" "To finally know the truth, to not have to pretend anymore that I don't see what's right in front of me." She turned to look at him directly. "I'm sorry it took me so long to understand what kind of man my father really was." "You're not responsible for his choices," Colt said gently, "and you couldn't have seen the truth until you were ready to see it. And now that I have, now you get to decide who you want to be, independent of who your father was or what your family name used to mean." The phrase "used to mean" carried particular weight. By morning, the Harrow name would be associated with criminality and fraud rather than wealth and influence. Evangeline would have to build a new identity entirely, without the advantages of money or social position. "I don't even know where I'll live," she said, voicing her fears aloud for the first time. "The boarding house is paid through the end of the month, but after that," she shrugged, trying to appear more confident than she felt. "Belmare's not a bad place to start over," Colt observed. "Folks here judge you by what you do, not where you came from." "And what would I do? I don't exactly have practical skills for frontier life." "You're intelligent, you can read and write better than most, and you've got a good head for business when it's honest business. Mrs. Patterson could probably use help with the school, and there's talk of starting a newspaper now that the town's growing." The suggestions were practical and encouraging, but Evangeline sensed something held back in Colt's manner, as if he were carefully avoiding more personal topics. "What about you?" she asked. "What will you do now that the investigation is resolved?" "Depends," he said carefully. "On what? On whether you plan to stay in Belmare?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither of them had directly addressed. Evangeline realized they were approaching the moment when everything unspoken would finally have to be acknowledged. "Would it matter to you if I stayed?" "It would matter more than almost anything," Colt replied, his voice barely above a whisper. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Evangeline understood that her transformation was complete. The frightened young woman who had stepped off the stage weeks ago had been replaced by someone ready to choose love over security, truth over comfort, and an uncertain future over a comfortable lie. The next morning brought news that would change everything once again. Marshal Henderson arrived at the boarding house with an official-looking document and an expression that mixed satisfaction with concern. "Miss Harrow, I have some developments you need to know about," he said, settling into the parlor chair across from her. "The federal court has ruled on the disposition of the fraudulently acquired properties." Evangeline braced herself for whatever was coming. She'd assumed that the land would simply be returned to its original owners, but the legal complexities of unwinding years of fraudulent transactions were apparently more complicated than she'd understood. The court has determined that the original owners should be compensated for their losses and offered the opportunity to repurchase their properties at fair market value, the marshal continued. However, there's also the question of what to do with improvements that were made using fraudulent funds. What kind of improvements? Buildings, fencing, irrigation systems developments that increased the value of the properties but were paid for with money obtained through criminal activities. Henderson consulted his notes. In several cases, including the Morrison Ranch, the improvements represent significant investments that can't simply be ignored. I'm not sure I understand the implications. The court has proposed a solution that's somewhat unusual, but which seems fair under the circumstances. The properties will be sold at public auction, with the proceeds used first to compensate the original owners for their losses, and any remaining funds distributed to other victims of your father's fraud. Evangeline nodded, though she still wasn't clear why this news required a special visit from the marshal. The unusual part, Henderson continued, is that you've been granted first right of refusal on any properties you choose to bid on. The court recognizes that you acted in good faith to expose the crimes and that you'll be suffering significant financial hardship as a result of your father's actions. The offer was stunning in its implications. She could potentially acquire property in Belmare legally and honestly, building a future here based on her own choices rather than inherited wealth. "But I don't have any money," she said practically. "My father's assets are all frozen pending the resolution of the criminal proceedings." "That's where it gets interesting," Henderson said with something that might have been a smile. "The territorial government has established a fund to assist witnesses who cooperated with the investigation. It's not a large amount, but it might be enough to make a down payment on a smaller property, with the remainder payable over time." Before Evangeline could fully process this information, a commotion outside drew their attention to the window. A crowd was gathering in the street, and she could see several men on horseback approaching the town. As they drew closer, she recognized Tom Morrison among the riders, along with several other ranchers who had lost property to her father's schemes. "What's happening?" she asked. "I believe Mr. Morrison and the others are here to bid on their former properties," Henderson replied. "The auction is scheduled for this afternoon." Evangeline felt a sudden stab of anxiety. If the original owners were returning to reclaim their land, what place would there be for her in Belmare? She'd been assuming that her future lay in this town, with these people who had accepted her transformation, but perhaps that assumption had been naive. The auction took place in front of the courthouse, with most of the town in attendance. Evangeline stood at the back of the crowd, uncertain of her role in the proceedings, but unwilling to miss what felt like a pivotal moment in Belmare's history. Tom Morrison was the first to step forward when his former property was announced. His bid was modest but confident, based on his knowledge of what the land was truly worth. When no one else offered a competing bid, the auctioneer awarded him the property to enthusiastic applause from the crowd. The same pattern repeated for most of the other fraudulently acquired ranches. The original owners bid successfully for their former properties, often with financial help from neighbors who had pooled resources to make the repurchases possible. But when the Morrison Ranch foreman's position was mentioned, along with the small house and few acres that came with it, Tom Morrison did something unexpected. "I'd like to withdraw that property from my bid," he announced loudly. "I've got my land back, and that's enough for me. Someone else might have better use for the foreman's place." The auctioneer looked confused, but Marshal Henderson stepped forward to clarify the situation. "Mr. Morrison is within his rights to specify which portions of the property he wishes to purchase. The foreman's residence and associated land can be auctioned separately." Evangeline felt her heart begin to race as she understood what was happening. The small property would be perfect for someone starting over, someone who needed a place to build a new life from honest beginnings. "Do I hear an opening bid on the foreman's property?" the auctioneer called. $50, Evangeline called out, her voice carrying clearly across the sudden silence. The crowd turned to look at her, and she saw a mixture of surprise, approval, and encouragement in their faces. These people had watched her transformation from Theodore Harrow's privileged daughter to someone willing to sacrifice everything for principle. Now, they were seeing her take the final step in that transformation, choosing to build a future in their community based on her own efforts rather than inherited advantage. 55, called another voice, and Evangeline turned to see Colt standing near the front of the crowd. Their eyes met across the assembled townspeople, and she saw something in his expression that made her heart leap. He wasn't trying to outbid her, he was offering to share the cost, to make it possible for her to afford the property that would give her a place in Belmare. 60, she called back, understanding that they were negotiating their future together in front of the entire town. 65, Colt replied, his voice warm with something that might have been laughter. 75, Evangeline said, abandoning the formal bidding process in favor of the more important conversation they were really having. Sold to the partnership of Miss Harrow and Mr. McCrae, the auctioneer declared, apparently deciding that any bid at this point was better than continuing the unusual auction. As the crowd began to disperse, congratulating the successful bidders and discussing the day's events, Colt made his way through the people to reach Evangeline's side. "Partners?" he asked quietly. "In everything," she replied, understanding that they were making promises that went far beyond property ownership. "You realize this means you're truly committed to staying in Belmare, no going back to St. Louis society." "I wouldn't go back if they begged me," Evangeline said firmly. "This is where I belong now. This is where we belong." As the sun set over their new property, their honest property, purchased with clean money and built on shared dreams rather than stolen wealth, Evangeline realized that the scared young woman who had arrived on the stage had completed her transformation. She was no longer Theodore Harrow's daughter. She was simply Evangeline, ready to build something beautiful with the man who had taught her to see beyond surfaces to the truth beneath. 6 months later, Evangeline stood in the doorway of the small house she and Colt had transformed into their home, watching her husband work with a young horse in the corral they'd built together. The scene would have been impossible to imagine when she first arrived in Belmare, not just because she'd had no idea such a man as Colt McCrae existed, but because she'd had no idea such a woman as she'd become was possible. The house itself bore testament to their partnership in ways both practical and symbolic. Above the front door, Colt had carved an inscription in the weathered wood, "Sapientia et amor," wisdom and love. The Latin phrase that had once been a barrier between them had become a bridge, representing everything they'd learned about looking beyond surfaces to find truth and beauty. Their wedding 3 months earlier had been a community celebration unlike anything Belmare had ever seen. The entire town had contributed something: food, decorations, music, or simply their presence as witnesses to a love story that had captivated everyone who'd watched it unfold. Tom Morrison had insisted on hosting the reception at his restored ranch, saying it was only fitting that the celebration should take place on land that had been returned to its rightful owner through Evangeline's courage. The federal investigation had concluded with Theodore Harrow's conviction on multiple charges of fraud and conspiracy. He'd been sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, and his business empire had been completely dismantled. The funds recovered from liquidating his assets had been used to compensate his victims, though many had suffered losses that could never be fully repaired. Evangeline had written to her father once since his conviction, a letter that had taken her weeks to compose and had ultimately contained only a few sentences. She was sorry for what had happened to him, but she could not regret the choices she'd made. She hoped that someday he would understand that real strength came from building rather than destroying, from helping rather than exploiting. She'd received no reply and didn't expect one. The transformation of her own life had been less dramatic, but more profound. She'd taken a position teaching at the Belmare School, discovering that her education at Miss Whitmore's finishing school had actually prepared her quite well for frontier pedagogy, not because of the specific subject she'd studied, but because she'd learned to think clearly and communicate effectively. The children adored her, especially when she and Colt team taught lessons that combined literature with practical knowledge, showing them that learning could be both beautiful and useful. In the evenings, their small house had become an informal gathering place for the scattered residents who shared a love of books and ideas. The traveling preacher still brought his trunk of books twice a year, but now he found an eager market for everything from philosophy to poetry to scientific treatises. The dream of starting a newspaper had materialized into the Belmare Weekly Herald, with Evangeline serving as editor and Colt contributing articles about agricultural techniques and natural history. "How's the training going?" she called to Colt, as the young horse finally allowed him to approach without shying away. "She's starting to trust," he replied, his voice carrying the same patient satisfaction she'd first heard when he'd spoken Latin in the dusty street. "Just needed someone to show her that not all humans mean trouble." The metaphor wasn't lost on either of them. They'd both had to learn to trust again. She to trust her own judgment after discovering how wrong she'd been about so many things, and he to trust that love could survive the weight of truth and the complications of different backgrounds. Their partnership had extended beyond their personal relationship to encompass genuine collaboration in improving life in Belmare. The town was growing steadily, attracting settlers who were drawn by stories of a community that valued honesty and hard work over social position and inherited wealth. The railroad that Theodore Harrow had schemed to control was being built by legitimate companies using honest contracts. And when it finally reached Belmare next year, the economic benefits would be shared by everyone rather than concentrated in the hands of a single corrupt businessman. As evening settled over the prairie, Evangeline found herself thinking about the cameo brooch that had once symbolized everything she'd thought she wanted to be. She'd sold it months ago to help pay for school supplies, and she didn't miss it at all. The legacy she was building now as a teacher, a wife, a member of a community that measured worth by character rather than pedigree, felt infinitely more valuable than any piece of jewelry. Colt finished his work with the horse and walked toward the house, pausing to kiss her forehead as he passed through the doorway. The gesture was casual and affectionate, the kind of unconscious intimacy that developed between people who'd chosen to build a life together based on respect and shared values rather than social expectations. "Any mail today?" he asked, washing his hands at the basin they'd placed near the window. "Letter from Mrs. Henderson. She's been invited to speak at a women's suffrage meeting in Kansas City about the role frontier women played in exposing the land frauds." Evangeline smiled at the memory of the boarding house keeper's delight at being considered an expert on anything, and a package from the Territorial Education Department, new books for the school. "What kind of books?" "Mathematics, geography, and a complete set of Shakespeare." She paused, remembering her first encounter with Colt's unexpected literary knowledge. "I thought maybe we could read some of the comedies aloud in the evenings. Community theater, frontier style." The idea clearly appealed to him. Much ado about nothing might work well, or As You Like It. "As You Like It indeed," Evangeline agreed, thinking about how appropriate the title was for their situation. They'd created exactly the life they wanted, built from honest effort and mutual affection rather than inherited expectations or social pressure. As they prepared for sleep, Evangeline caught sight of herself in the small mirror above their dresser and was struck by how much her reflection had changed. The carefully styled hair and elaborate clothing of her Louis days had been replaced by simpler arrangements, more suited to active work. But the biggest change was in her expression gone, was the carefully controlled composure of a young lady trained to hide her thoughts and feelings. In its place was the open, confident bearing of a woman who knew exactly who she was and what she valued. "Do you ever regret it?" Colt asked quietly, following her gaze to the mirror. "Giving up the life you were supposed to have?" "Never," she replied without hesitation. "I didn't give up anything real. I just stopped pretending that guilt was the same as gold." Outside their window, the prairie stretched away into darkness, vast and full of possibilities. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, students to teach, community problems to solve, a future to build together one day at a time. But tonight, in the small house they'd made into a home, surrounded by books they'd chosen and furniture they'd built and dreams they'd shared, Evangeline felt the deep satisfaction that came from living a life based on truth rather than pretense. The Latin inscription above their door caught the lamplight as Colt extinguished the flame. Sapientia et amor, wisdom and love. It had taken a challenge issued in anger and answered in perfect poetry to teach them both that the most important education came not from books or schools or social position, but from the courage to see beyond surfaces to the truth beneath. And in that truth, they'd found not just love, but the foundation for a life worth living.